Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. Now, many of you know David Pratt from his written journalism, and because his beat covers everything from American elections to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, he's also a very fine photographer whose images vividly capture the humanity of every zone he's visited in the course of his extensive reportage. He'll shortly have a new book of some of his latest photography published, but he's also teamed up with Robbie Fraser to make some extraordinary documentaries for BBC covering his work in the Balkans, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and most recently he's been at the sharp end of the Ukrainian conflict because, like all top foreign correspondents, he needs to be where the action is. And so in the course of the next hour we'll be able to see some clips from these journeys into war, and outside of all of which I have to tell you he's an avaricious reader of coverage and comment from the vast range of books and periodicals which he consumes, so that's what makes him such a fine journalist as well as a terrific photographer and, as you will see, a wonderful documentary maker. Please welcome David Pratt. Now, David is very recently back from, I mean, this is quite worrying if you've gotten booked for your book festival and you go to Ukraine and you think, oh! Anyway, he's very recently back from Ukraine, so tell us a bit about what you found there.
Well, I was there for about 5 weeks on the last trip. We went just after the invasion, so we were there in sort of March, just after the Russian invasion on the February 24th. But that was a comparatively short visit, Ruth. We were just kind of sketching out the lie of the land, went through Lviv and then went to Kyiv. But, you know, the Russians were literally at the gates of Kyiv at that time. And it was just around that period, if you remember the atrocities, the massacres in Bucha and places like that took place. So the Russians were still very much a threat to the capital city. So that was a comparatively short trip. But then went back in sort of August, September for an extended stay. And Robbie and I were filming for about five weeks or so at that time. And it was just coincidentally, just before what we now know is the offensive in Kherson. You've probably heard of the huge offensive. People talk about it being a diversion or a feint at that time, because the real offensive initially took place up in Kharkiv in the north and east. But we got as far down as Mykolaiv, which is very close to Kherson. Indeed, you know, Mykolaiv, I think it was the 186th day of the war when we arrived in Mykolaiv, and only 25 days of that 186, the city hadn't been shelled and bombed. It was the most bombed city in Ukraine at that time. So we got a feel for what was just about to happen. Indeed, I remember actually coming back up from Mykolaiv to Kyiv, and we passed, it was bucketing with rain, and we passed this huge military convoy with boats, which we knew was obviously the preparations for the Kherson offensive and across the river. So that was a 5-week stint, and hopefully I'll be going back in January.
Well, we're going to have a little look at what you encountered in Ukraine, because this was filmed in Lviv, and David is in contact regularly with people in Lviv, so it's you'll be able to talk about that in a minute. But let's have a look at what you encountered when you were in Lviv recently.
The civilian toll, too, is high. Wave after wave of people have been displaced from the areas of fighting. So I'm outside Lviv railway station, which is just a teeming mass of humanity, mainly women and children, trolley bags, baggage, and they've arrived from all over Ukraine. Extraordinary. Can't imagine what it's like to have your life completely disrupted in this way and just to be cast adrift.
Меня зовут Алина, мы приехали из города Мелитополь, Запорожская область.
So where are you going now? Where are you hoping to go?
Мы планируем поехать в Болгарию к своей сестре. Там они работают, живут, и мы со своим племянником едем сейчас к ним.
Tell me about describe the situation where you came from.
В Мелитополе 24 числа в 5:30 утра начались взрывы. После этого еще было несколько взрывов. Началась война по всей Украине, как поняла, по южной стороне Украины. Было очень страшно. Я с ребенком была в тот момент. И было принято решение немножко подождать и ехать уже за границу, так как было небезопасно оставаться в Мелитополе. Мы не знаем, что будет дальше через неделю, поэтому лучше пока тихо мы уехали оттуда, с Мелитополя. Потом у нас в жилые дома попадали тоже осколки ракет. У нас сбивают эти ракеты, но осколки попадают в жилые дома. И пока мы остались целы, наш дом остался цел, мы решили выехать оттуда, потому что мы не знаем, возможно, следующий дом будет наш. Очень страшно, да.
It's just utterly chaotic. And you can tell just by looking at the faces of people, you know, the kind of uncertainty. Not so much fear, just a sort of confusion as to what lies ahead for them all. Well, we've just had an air raid siren go off here. I'm outside Lviv railway station. This is the first time I've heard the sirens go off here in the city since I've arrived. There doesn't seem to be any panic. People seem quite resigned to this, but it's an eerie sound, and who knows what it might mean this time. As we know, Lviv has been hit in the past, but only at strategic locations, not in the heart of the city. But it's a terrifying sound. Sadly familiar scene, certainly in historical terms, here in Europe. We thought this was all over a long time ago. Second World War, Bosnia, but here we are again. People fleeing conflict, people who don't know where they're going, people who have left behind tremendous destruction and a future that is very uncertain. We thought it was all in the past, but here it is, on our doorstep, in Europe, in the world, in 2022.
It's an extraordinary piece of footage, David, because I suppose we shouldn't think it was closer because it's in Europe in a way, because, humanity suffering like that is humanity suffering like that wherever it is, but somehow or other seeing people with all their worldly goods in a railway station in Europe, as you say, in 2022.
It has that resonance. There is a historical resonance there, and on more than one occasion when I've been in Ukraine, and we're going to see more of this obviously over the winter, there's already images emerging from the east at the moment where the snow is beginning to fall. And it's so reminiscent of the Eastern Front in the Second World War, trench warfare and stuff. I mean, absolutely horrendous. And if you think that footage was shot just after the Russian invasion, so it was early days. And within a few days of that being filmed, Lviv was hit and was hit a number of times, and it's got progressively worse since then. And the city now, of course, is completely without electricity and without water. And it's a huge, huge and very beautiful city. If any of you have ever been in Lviv, you've had a great privilege, because it is a fantastic and very rich culturally as a city. There's a slight resentment actually amongst a lot of Kievians, people from Kiev about Lviv. They kind of, a bit like the relationship between Glasgow and Edinburgh, if I can call it that, with Lviv being Edinburgh and Kiev being Glasgow,
We saw quite a lot of people at the beginning who decided to leave Kiev and they fled to Lviv, because at that point Lviv was considered, relatively speaking, a safe bet.
That's true. I mean, the first people I encountered actually, there's a crossing point called Shamolshul on the Polish side of the border. And on my very first trip in, and when I say very first trip in, you should remember I've been covering Ukraine on and off since 2014. I was there after the Euromaidan, and then there, obviously, when the Russian separatists began to make their presence felt in the Donbass and in Donetsk and whatever. So I've watched it over that 8 years when it wasn't figuring on the headlines, it wasn't figuring in people's minds, and it certainly wasn't the full-scale war that we have now. But, Lviv now has become, like so many of the cities across the country, really damaged. The infrastructure is hugely damaged now. And I dread to think what the coming weeks and months are going to bring within the country.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because we know that they've been targeting all the energy facilities and for all the obvious reasons. But we also know that winter's coming in, and winter's coming in hard, and it's not the kind of winter we see here anymore. It's serious winter. So if you've got no heating and occasional lighting and perhaps no water, do you think this famous Ukrainian resilience can survive?
If there's one weapon, if I can use that term, that the Ukrainians have that is insurmountable, it is their absolute determination and capacity to resist. I don't think in 40 years of covering conflicts around the world that I've come across many people in many parts of the world that are very resourceful and very resilient. The Afghans, the Kurds or whatever. But the Ukrainians there's something about them in this situation. One of the things that's really important is a young demographic. They're super resourceful, they're very IT savvy and stuff. I remember that going back to 2014. And they're very much a can-do type of people. They're really up and at it in every sense, whether it be sport, whether it be culture or whatever. And all of that's coming to play. I mean, for example, we've got the crew that we work with, the local team that we work with on the ground there. Olia, who heads up that team, she's in her 30s. She was someone who made TV commercials and was a producer before the war. Everybody with a skill set like that has put their shoulder to the wheel in terms of the war. So if you were a drone operator, what you're doing with drones right now in the front, and targeting Russian troops. If you were a media operator or a camera operator, you're archiving material or you're archiving war crimes or whatever. Everybody who has a specific civilian role, if they've not volunteered and picked up a gun and moved to the front line, then they are actually putting their shoulder at the wheel.
I wanted to ask you about the guys who went to the front line, because we had Angus Roxburgh here yesterday morning and you guys are sort of topping and tailing this year's book festival with tales from Ukraine, understandably. But Angus was saying that, the Russians had to resort to going into prisons and, bribing people to go into the front line, etc., etc. So they're obviously not a skilled trained army in the way that the Russians might have been in another era. But similarly, we saw in the early days of the war a lot of Ukrainians, like lawyers and teachers and nurses and people who had no particular skills with weapons, happily perhaps, but they're now in the front line as well.
They are. I mean, there was a massive surge of volunteers. I mean, people know, that if the Russians had been able to sweep across the country, we've seen what they've done in Bucha, in Mariupol and places like that. And every Ukrainian I spoke to said, there's no way, I'm not going to stand my ground here. I know what it means to my family. I know what it means to my kids, and for life here generally. We have no choice but to fight. But there's also an interesting component to that because, for example, I interviewed a few soldiers in Mykolaiv who have been in sort of, I suppose the equivalent here would be the TA, really, in a way. So they've been involved in this guy was a designer. He ran a company, a really successful global company, young man. But he'd done all his training and had served time in the Donbass region. So these guys suddenly became mobilized. But alongside that were massive numbers of ordinary folk who picked up a weapon and decided to go to the front lines, men and women, of course. Yeah. And adding to that, you've also got a huge number of international volunteers. I mean, it's probably the equivalent of Spain in the 1930s with the international brigades that went over. And it's amazing the range of nationalities that you find there. And these people are held in great esteem by the Ukrainians. And many of the legionnaires, as they're called now, the brigaders, are actually very much at the sharp end of the fighting. But if you compare that morale, if you like, as well as the kind of discipline and organizational skill set that Ukrainians have with these enforced mobics, that have been, the Russians have brought in, some, through the Wagner group, the mercenary group, out of prisons from distant areas of Dagestan or Siberia. Chechnya. It's very interesting, the contrast in that. When I was in Bucha, one of the curious things, the terrible atrocity that took place there, and we were on the street where all these bodies, that had been strewn, and you've probably seen the photographs of that street where those bodies were strewn. Now, obviously, Russian troops had been billeted in many of the houses, and they just moved in. And it was interesting what Ukrainians were telling me, that you could tell which unit had been billeted where, depending on the mess they'd made, right? So they were like more sophisticated units from some St. Petersburg or Moscow with officers perhaps that were better educated or whatever, that were actually behaving remarkably well. They weren't sleeping in their own crap, frankly, quite literally in many of the houses we went into. These guys they wouldn't use a flush toilet. Many of these Russian soldiers had never, from Siberia and from outlying areas, come from rural communities where they've never used a flush toilet in their lives, you know? And when you place this kind of individual into that environment, you know, it's very, very awkward for them. And on top of that now, the press ganging of everyone that's coming through. I mean, we're seeing constant photographs of them sleeping in trenches with no winter gear. You know, they've had to get their own boots, their own packs, whatever. A lot of the officers are drunk a lot of the time. You know, there are the regular units in the Russian army, but the vast majority now are people who don't want to fight. And that is in complete contrast to Ukrainians whose backs are to the wall and know they have no option here but to stand their ground.
I'm curious, you mentioned Donbass a minute ago, I'm curious about that portion of Ukraine which was largely Russian speaking and fairly well disposed
Well, I think that's a myth straight away. I'd like to lay that to rest instantly
about
the Russian speaking
lay that to rest
thing.
when I finish my question, which was that there's a lot of people in that area who seem to if not welcome the Russian invasion, were a lot less laid back about it than other parts of Ukraine, according to the media here. So how do they, I mean, having seen what the Russians have done in terms of, you know, carnage, do you think now pretty well every Ukrainian of whatever origin is anti-Russian?
No, I think what happened, I mean, just to be clear about what, number one is that this idea that there's Russian-speaking areas and Ukrainian-speaking areas is a nonsense. I mean, my own interpreter and Olya that I was talking about, they speak, or did speak, Russian at home. Her father was a colonel in the Red Army and then became a colonel in the Ukrainian army, right? In the Donbass, Russian is widely spoken, but so is Ukrainian also. So the language thing is a bit of a myth. You know, the people speak both languages in many parts of the country. More people are speaking Ukrainian as a kind of act of patriotism rather than speaking Russian, as Olya does now, but she's fluent. First language is Russian, really. The Donbass is interesting because back after Euromaidan in 2014, 2015, when the separatists were beginning to, the pro-Russian separatists, really it wasn't so much that they were pro-Russian, it was that they were annoyed about their neglect by the government in Kyiv. You know, that's a huge country, Ukraine. In the east, the Donbass was neglected. I mean, I always compare it with, if you're familiar with those Soviet socialist realist paintings, you know, with the clenched fists and the Colgate smiles and the factories, you know, growing and manufacturing. It was the opposite. It was like Lanarkshire, where I come from originally, after the industrial meltdown. You know, there was young guys standing around street corners or whatever. Meanwhile, as one of them said to me at the time, you know, the coffee house hipsters of Kiev are actually getting all the attention. We're not, right? We would like some attention from Kyiv about the problems we have here with unemployment, economic woes. Now remember, also they speak Russian, of course, but they sit there watching Russian television every night, Russian broadcast on the radio, and a certain Mr. Putin was sending chaps in to kind of mischief make within that area at that time. So there was an opportunity, I think, in the Donbass back then to kind of basically rein in the issue or the problem and address that, but they neglected it, and hence it grew, it mushroomed into a separatist movement antagonized by Moscow, leading ultimately to where we are right now.
But these people who had mischief made amongst them, are they now, having seen what's happened to their fellow Ukrainians, have they changed that tune?
Some have. There are those that became pro-separatist to begin with, even fought in the trenches in that 8-year protracted battle that went on that we never paid attention to. But some of them, having witnessed and seen what the Russians have done in those areas, have kind of switched sides again and have had second thoughts, because they are first and foremost Ukrainians. So they are thinking again, not all. There's some remain determined to be part of those self-proclaimed republics that we hear about. But there has been a shift, I think, and the more the Russians commit those atrocities, the more they see the kind of bludgeoning of the civilian infrastructure in their country. Many of them must be thinking twice about the allegiances that they initially had.
How worried are you as a voyeur of all of this? How worried are you about the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe? I'm not talking about a nuclear war type catastrophe, though that's obviously a concern as well. I'm talking about one of the nuclear facilities being damaged and blown up.
I think it's been nip and tuck so far. You know, one of the biggest problems, I think, not just in this war, but in any war on this scale, because the scale of this is quite different from the stuff, a lot of the wars that I've covered in terms of hybrid warfare or whatever. This is much more conventional in that way. The biggest problem in any conflict situation like that is the capacity to make a mistake. You know, it might not be intentional. My biggest fear is that, you know, a shell lands in the wrong place, you know. I mean, we saw what happened when those missile fragments landed in Poland, you know. I mean, it was like you know, the doomsday clock must have went like that. Not that it's that far off midnight as it stands at the moment, but it must have lurched forward. And you could almost sense the collective palpable panic within the global community at that moment. You know, is this an attack on NATO? And a NATO country means an attack on all. Will they respond? So the capacity to make mistakes. But I don't think it's in Russia's interest to deliberately target those nuclear installations. It's interesting what they've chosen to target and what they've not. Now they're getting desperate, so they're hitting just about everything. But, you know, you take the railway system in Ukraine, for example, which is the absolute life's blood for the entire country in terms of material support and whatever. Now, the Russians have hit it, but not as hard as you thought, certainly not at the beginning. And the reason for that was they were so damn confident that they were going to take the country that they wanted to keep a lot of the infrastructure intact so they could just roll in. I mean, it's a commonly known story, if you're aware of it. I mean, we were there during Independence Day, that Russian officers, senior Russian officers, had already earmarked the hotels they were going to be staying in and had new uniforms for the victory parade they were going to have in Kyiv, you know, within a matter of weeks. Well, they got that one bloody wrong, that's for sure, you know. Big time. So, you know, I think I'm more worried about mistakes, miscalculations, than I am about deliberate targeting.
Cock-up theory.
Cock-up theory, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've spent most of your adult life at the sharp end of one conflict or another, so I'm not going to ask you if you're a war junkie because you are.
Well, yeah, I'm not, but I am.
Well,
I know what you mean.
But
it's a difficult thing to lay off after you've been doing it for so long.
You want to be where the action is, I think it's fair to say. And we've got another clip now from a film you made in Iraq, and I think it underscores quite graphically just how scary things can get in these missions. So can we run the Iraq clip?
The smoke behind me is coming from the village of Gaza. Beyond that is the third largest city in Iraq, Mosul. For the last half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, the Peshmerga have been attacking this position. A few moments ago we came under fire. American troops are just a few hundred yards ahead of us, acting as spotters to bring in airstrikes and to direct the Peshmerga gunfire on the village. It appears that some villagers and possibly some Iraqi soldiers are holding out there.
What happened here at Kalak was a good example of how things can get hairy fast for an independent reporter.
What is it, mortar? Yeah, mortar. What am I fucking doing here? Time to stand through. Sounds about right, guys.
Now, what you don't see in that film, ladies and gentlemen, is David is saying to people who are obviously come under fire at the same time with him, supposed colleagues, albeit from a different broadcasting organisation, and he's saying, any chance for a ride, guys? And you think the next bit of the film will show David's gear being thrown into the Jeep, but now read on.
No, that didn't happen. He said no, actually, much to my amazement. I think the cameraman in particular was pretty spooked at that point. There is a kind of strange tailpiece. So basically they just drove off and
left you there.
Left me a few others as well. But you know, the problem was we wanted to get out of range of the mortars. I mean, it was probably only about a mile down the road, but you know, out of range. And But the tailpiece is that later that evening, said cameraman and producer, and the reporter, who's very well known, some of you may recognise, I'm not going to mention him by name.
Julian Mannion.
Julian Mannion. All right. And Julian came tottering up to my hotel room that night with Sean, the cameraman, and sort of tapped on the door and said, we had a little bit of a problem today. Sean didn't manage to get any of the footage at that key moment. Is there any chance we could use yours? To which I gracefully said, yes. If you believe that.
I don't, but never mind. Not that matters. But I mean, that was truly scary moment, and it's not an isolated, truly scary moment.
No, not at all.
So
in some ways, it's quite tame, actually. Right?
Well, but when you go into a trench situation like that, and you know you're going to come under fire, what is it propels you into that kind of danger?
I think, there's the old Robert Capa thing, if your pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough. I mean, I think there is an element of that. You have to be, I think photographers in particular need to be literally there. The writer can always be a little bit further back, theoretically, although most writers that I know are usually on the front lines as well. In terms of an individual motivation, I think it is a professional kind of challenge, really. It's one that you feel... it's one of the reasons I don't really operate in other areas of journalism. I find this kind of reporting or war reporting the ultimate kind of challenge to me professionally. It requires a kind of mental strength. It requires a physical strength, which I sadly don't have anymore in that way. I don't run as fast as I did then, although it's amazing how fast you can run when you're being shot at. And it requires a kind of resourcefulness that, I'm not getting weary of, but it's getting more difficult to maintain. And one of the things you don't want to do is work in a conflict zone, particularly if you're embedded with military units. For example, in Afghanistan, when I was with 4-5 Commando, the Royal Marines, or the 101st Airborne in Afghanistan also. And these guys, women, are all super fit. They're all 19 and rearing to go. And you can become a liability in that situation. I think, it's a kind of younger person's game when it gets right down to that frontline kind of stuff. But the motivation is primarily the professional challenge. That is what I love about it, is delivering the goods under duress, I think, really is
and no shortage of duress. I'm just looking, David, you've plonked down in front of you a camera. Now that's quite unusual, because David usually has a camera round his neck. I'm not quite sure whether he showers with it, but I've never seen him without it. Well, I've never seen him in the shower either, I should say.
Trust me, Ruth, you would remember that. To be honest, the shower thing is actually quite an interesting observation, because Henri Cartier-Bresson, the great French photographer, who said he took his camera everywhere except the shower. I think he even smoked in the shower, but I mean, it is one of these things. It's a bit like with most of us with the mobile phone. It becomes like a kind of attachment to you, and I'm always terrified that you miss something. Sure as God, if you don't have it with you, then that picture presents itself inevitably.
And you're obviously very keen on black and white images telling a more powerful story.
Yeah, I've started. I was asked this. I was just back from Geneva, where I was giving a couple of talks at the international school to some students, many students, thousands of students there. And I was being asked this question: why do you shoot in black and white? For them, it's kind of strange, that generation. But there was a huge period. I'm sure some people here will remember those magazines and supplements when most of the kind of photography that I produced was shot in black and white. But there's a kind of aesthetic reason for me as well. I think colour, unless you're using colour specifically for its own ends, and even the colour photographers that I love, Alex Webb or Harry Gruert from Magnum, it's very controlled. But I find it quite superfluous to the kind of the emphasis on composition and tightness. The only difficulty I have with it is that obviously picture editors expect colour today, but fair play to a few editors that I worked with recently who've been running the stuff that was shot in black and white. And the curious thing is that many people who have read the pieces or looked at those photographs have commented on how powerful it is in black and white, and they'd forgotten how powerful black and white photography can be.
And of course you've got another, you already had a book on photography, which was a wonderful book, and that was in the Sogo Gallery in Glasgow, in Turngatt in Glasgow, and you've got another one coming out.
Well, I'm hoping to do basically, again, it was another reason I was visiting Geneva. We're looking at an enhanced retrospective, which is not till January 24, although that's almost a year away, which is not a lot of time, because we're hoping to bring together all the documentaries in Geneva, at the Arts Centre in Geneva. And it's a huge complex, the Arts Centre there. And it will be run over maybe 3-4 floors, and it will be a much, much bigger retrospective, and probably the definitive retrospective to date of my work. And we'll show the films, which will coincide with the Human Rights Film Festival in Geneva as well.
The thing that makes you, well, many things make you unusual, David, but one of the things that makes you unusual is that, you're not just a man with a camera and a man with a plan and all of that. You're also somebody who writes, and you don't just write about war, you write about everything. You write about American politics, you write a column called Four Corners, which is everywhere. And obviously you read copiously in order to keep up to speed with that, where you haven't physically visited. But I mean, you write copiously. I mean, when we were chatting upstairs, David said that yesterday he wrote 2,000 words at 5 in the morning, because that was the only time he had to do it. I mean, 2,000 words. I mean, that makes me feel quite sick.
It made me feel quite sick afterwards as well, and it happens with alarming regularity. But again, it's the alarming regularity that's probably kind of, built up a resilience with me. One of the things as well is that if you're operating as a reporter, particularly in the environments that I have, it's often very difficult to file. I mean, when I go back to Ukraine in January, electricity, how do you get access to the internet? How do you get your story out?
How do you charge your phone?
How do you charge your phone? All of that sort of stuff. So I've been so used to writing in places under duress, in the back of a Jeep or in a tent somewhere, or in some billet, in some place in Afghanistan, in a cave or whatever, that somehow even sitting down at 5 o'clock in the morning and study at home is comparatively comfortable by
luxurious,
that. Almost luxurious, yeah.
Though you do see, I mean, I've seen quite a lot of footage of reporters from various organisations, and they're now able to send their pictures back from the laptop, sometimes sitting on top of a Jeep, which is simultaneously sending other stuff off. So the nature of war reporting has changed quite dramatically.
Hugely. Again, this is what I was talking about in Geneva, to a generation that don't understand pre-digital times, for years and years when I was filing before, particularly, or sending photographs back, you were shooting film. It wasn't digital, obviously. So you had to carry that film in. That film had to be processed, printed, analog sent on drums, sent that way. Everything's completely changed. You've got lightweight kit, you can connect, provided you've got access to the internet and got power. Those still remain problematic issues in any conflict environment, But it was a revelation for someone like myself who grew up in a kind of pre-digital journalistic era to move over into a time zone when I can literally sort of sit somewhere and ping pictures straight back off your phone. We've all done it, we all do it.
Aye.
But it has transformed. I think the industry's changed in other ways as well. There's negative aspects to it. The tech is great. Citizen journalism has made an impact. I mean, I remember when I was covering the Arab Spring uprisings, and particularly in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, and in Libya. The citizen journalism was really beginning to make its mark. But the problem with citizen journalism is that, so many of these people are activists as well. So you're never quite sure about what you're getting. And there's a whole issue now, of course, of alternate fake news, misinformation, disinformation. That's something that the current generation, again, those students I was talking to recently, are much more across. They get this because they're familiar with this on a day-to-day basis.
They get the fact that there's a lot of fake news and disinformation and all of the above. What they don't necessarily get is any better idea than the rest of us how to determine what is fake.
Sure, but I do think that, again, indeed these students, the courses they were taking in their curriculum included the kind of dissection of that and kind of guidance almost as to how to circumvent or look out for the telltale signs and check sources. And there are more and more organisations within our own industry that are beginning to sort of use fact-checking facilities. I mean, Reuters does it, for example, now, and there's new agencies being set up that purely do fact-checking for those other agencies that, frankly, don't have the time or the logistics or the money. And that's another negative aspect, of course, of the industry, is that, you know, as newspapers have shrunk and budgets shrink, you know, I don't despair, but it angers the shit out of me, frankly, that, you know, the lack of money, not just for journalism, the investment in journalism, but the lack of investment, particularly in foreign reporting and international journalism. You know, as we know right now, all of us, we're being impacted by a war directly or indirectly right here on our European doorstep. It's therefore more imperative than ever that we have access to the most accurate, up-to-date information. And there is no substitute for that than eyewitness reporting and being there on the ground. That is the first line in this. And, you know, to see that diminished or eroded as a result of nearsighted editorial policies or, you know, no investment in journalism is frustrating and, frankly, downright dangerous for all of us.
You mentioned a little while ago that you were embedded with a couple of units of fit young men in Afghanistan. So we've got a bit of footage that you shot in Afghanistan as well. And I think we talked a minute ago about the danger of war reportage, but there's also a bit of sensory deprivation involved, as the footage from Afghanistan will vividly illustrate.
The marches could last anywhere between, you know, 10, 14 hours, 16-hour marches through the Hindu Kush. It was exhausting. And even though I regarded myself as incredibly fit, it was so difficult to keep up with these people. They're as hard as nails, and many of them are mountain people, you know. So for them, it was a jaunt. The bottom line was, when you crossed the border into Afghanistan, there was no backup. Most of the time, you didn't even know where you were. You obviously had to travel as lightly as possible. You were dressed the way they were dressed. You ate what they ate. You drank the water that they drank. If anything happened, you got sick, wounded, you couldn't make it, you were on your own. It was up to the Mujahs to get you out, if indeed they wanted to do so. The whole aspect of sleeping out and living in the mountains and whatever, but it came as a real shock to me once when I was pointed to a dunny in this village. And it wasn't until I got there and did the needy, I suddenly realised there is no such thing as loo paper. It wasn't until I spoke to one of the Afghans afterwards and said, "What do you do about that?" And he said, "Well, you just use the stones that are lying around." Anybody who wipes their backside with stones has got to be a tough people to defeat.
Absolutely, and they are a tough people, of course, but the
They
tragedy...
are very tough people.
The tragedy re-unfolding, I suppose we should say, in Afghanistan now is disastrous in terms of everything. But I was interested in yet more this week, yet more restrictions put on women in Afghanistan. Now, we've seen what happened to young Iranian women when they decided to rebel. Have the young women in Afghanistan, who have got so much to lose in terms of their education and everything else and their personal freedom, but have they really got too much on their plate with poverty and everything else to actually engage the way the Iranians have?
To some extent, that's true. Afghanistan's a very different, it might border Iran, but it's a very different place from Iran. And, you know, you've got to remember that swathes of Afghanistan, those areas, that was back in the Soviet times, of course, but swathes of Afghanistan are virtually medieval. I mean, the cities like Kabul or Kandahar or whatever, obviously, are a bit more sophisticated, Kabul in particular. But it's like stepping back in time in so many of these areas. And obviously, poverty, hunger, you know, unemployment are the main contentions. But that said, women in Afghanistan have shown time and time again, and many of them are still taking bravely to the streets in Kabul and elsewhere, at huge risk, as women in Iran are doing, and people in Iran generally are doing. But in Afghanistan, it is particularly difficult, I think, simply because of the kind of lack of infrastructure or support, even from a lot of their male, you know, country folk. So it's a difficult area for women to operate in that way. The courage that it takes to step out onto the street in Kabul and confront and demonstrate is beyond belief, in my opinion. I just
It's
find
just
it
that,
remarkable.
we remember what happened there when the Taliban were ruling the roost in the first place, but then there came a period where they got a taste of what it meant to be to educate.
Absolutely.
They became part of the judiciary. They went to university. They became proper citizens again. So having tasted that, having smelt that kind of freedom, it must be more difficult the second time around.
It's impossible, I think, to put the lid back on that. Again, the demographics really important here. The vast majority of Afghans are very young, and certainly this. But I can't emphasise enough this. City and rural split. Very few women have really benefited that much from the years that the West was involved there. And now, as we know, after the catastrophic withdrawal, when we left them in the lurch, it was like one step forward and 20 back, so they're in a much, much worse place than they were previously. But certainly in the urban environment, in that kind of educated elite, if you like, you're not going to be able to put that lid back on. The desire is huge, Afghans are fiercely, patriotic in the sense that they love their country. They're fiercely independent people. It's no surprise that no one has ever really successfully invaded the country, whether it be Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, the Brits in the 1840s, or whatever, the Soviets. So they all got a bit of a bloody nose, Afghans don't like being told what to do. And it's a fact that while the Taliban, I think a lot of people don't realise, they instantly think of the Taliban as being Afghan, but a lot of the makeup of the Taliban that is controlling the structure inside Afghanistan right now are from neighbouring Pakistan, and frankly there's no love lost between Pakistanis and Afghans. That's a historical fact. So you can see a growing resentment there, and a combination of not stepping backwards and this fierce independence means that don't give up on Afghanistan yet. There is already signs of a burgeoning resistance in the far north of the country, but no one seems to be supporting that. The son of the great resistance leader Ahmad Shah Massoud, of course, who fought the Russians and who was assassinated just 2 days before 9/11, of course, deliberately because they knew he could actually unite the country. The young Massoud Jr. is already galvanising up in Badakhshan some of that resistance.
You mentioned just a minute ago, I want to throw this out to the audience, David, because we started late, so we're borrowing a bit of time here. But you mentioned the word you used was the catastrophic withdrawal. I mean, when you watched that in real time, what did you feel?
Well, there was two things about it. One was that I couldn't be there, and the reason for that was simply that because of the pandemic, we had been waiting for the green light to go and make the Iraq film, and suddenly the window presented itself, and we were contracted with the BBC, so I could not be in Kabul. And it's one of my great regrets because Afghanistan is probably the country that's closest to my heart, and I've seen it through all kinds of turbulent ups and downs and whatever. So not to be there when that huge story that it was unfolding was really frustrating for me personally. But it was also frustrating to watch the absolute shambles unfold that it did and the way in which it happened. I mean, anyone who knows the country or observers or watchers of the country over decades, as I've been and many of my colleagues are, knew what the problem was. When Robbie and I were making those the Pictures from Afghanistan film, we were in Kabul and the Taliban were at the gates. I mean, our Afghan friends would say, they could be here in 3 hours. The minute the Americans, the coalition leaves, they're in here. And that's exactly what happened. So it wasn't like no one, anyone was surprised about this, least of all the Afghans themselves. So when you hear, from the Americans or from the coalition and the allies talking about how, our intelligence wasn't right, or, good God, we'd been here for years and years. How could they have got it so badly wrong? The bottom line was they didn't want to be there anymore. They knew that they were on a hiding to nothing. You had gone from, revenge almost for 9/11 to becoming nation building, to becoming an entrenched war that, no one knew, no one believed that they could really win in that sense,
And meanwhile, our own Foreign Secretary was busy on his halls.
Well, he's on his holidays, of course. I mean, it's one of the most, I think, ignominious it's a terrible period, I think, in terms of British foreign policy, in terms of Western response, American foreign policy. It's a low point, frankly. And Afghans have got long memories, the whole Pashtunwali code includes revenge and stuff like that. They will never trust the West again. Every country that goes in there and promises the Afghans something better invariably craps on them from a great height, and they will remember that. If there is a burgeoning of ISIS or, terrorist groups in the country, and there's evidence of that already happening again, it could be transnational in their nature, and we are forced to go back in there. Don't expect the Afghans to be running to help us this time around. That's for sure.
Well, we're going to, we've got a roving mic, though I can't actually see Jim in this lighting, but I'm sure he's around. Yes, I can see him. There he goes. We've got a roving mic to say, so if you've got questions for David, we won't have a huge amount of time, but we are going to borrow the 10 minutes we lost. So, questions for David, please. Who's going to start? Here we go.
David, I was employed as an MOD war planner in November 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. We all thought then that was it. We were in peaceful times. Where did we go wrong?
In '89, which is when the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan at that time. What do you mean?
I meant generally worldwide.
From a military perspective.
From a political perspective.
From a political perspective, I think, speaking from a UK perspective, I can't, but I do think we dropped a baton in a lot of intelligence and a lot of work. I mean, as was evident during the debacle, in the withdrawal from Kabul, the Foreign Office and all of these attendant arms of government and whatever. I've got people I know that have worked in the Foreign Office for decades, and you were hearing a litany of disaster after disaster, of mismanagement and nonsense going on. And to some extent, that could be reflected in certain military areas as well. So I think we took our eye off the ball massively. That's where we went wrong. We let our guard down, we let standards slip. We certainly, from an intelligence perspective, really let the baton drop in that way and couldn't see what was around the corner. And to some extent, that's being reflected in what's happening in Ukraine now as well. We're having to play catch up with this. It's kind of interesting that, going back to Afghanistan, historically Britain has got a long, long history of connection with Afghanistan, good, bad, and indifferent, But it was interesting that the Americans, who knew nothing about that part of the world, Britain, going back to the days of British India and goodness knows what, partition, always had a good presence there, a good connection militarily, left its own kind of print there. But it was interesting that the Americans caught up very, very quickly. And in a way, American intelligence was actually more efficient and reliable at a certain point during the Afghan war than what the Brits were actually bringing out of there. So that, again, I think is indicative. To sum it up, I think we dropped a bat. We took our eye off the ball a long time ago. We let a lot of this stuff slip that we should have been keeping an eye on in a very rapidly changing world.
More questions? Well, we've got one here and one in the middle.
David, slightly nerdy question. How do you manage the personal economics, business, diary, scheduling side of doing so many different things in so many different locations?
With difficulty would be the short answer. I am freelance, and it's a good question, because I think anyone here, or most people here, are probably blissfully unaware of how difficult it is to operate as a freelance journalist, even domestically. To do so on an international front as a foreign correspondent is frankly almost impossible. And I am fortunate, because I do so much broadcast work as well as writing, as well as photography. At least it gives me sort of income streams to some extent that if I was relying purely as a writer or a photographer, I'd really be struggling with that. The other aspect of it, of course, is that as a freelance, the idea that you could just nip off to these places, that was the way it used to be in the so-called good old days when I was younger. You just put stuff in a bag, take the camera, and off you would jolly well trot. But now, of course, you cannot undertake and go to these places and file for broadcasters or whatever unless you tick certain boxes. There's health and safety in a war zone, would you believe that? I kid you not. So you have like hostile environment training that you have to do. I'll share this with you. In almost 40 years, I'd never done hostile environment training. And then when we started making the BBC documentaries, they said, well, you can't make them unless you do hostile environment training. And when I went down to the course, which is usually run by former special forces, the one I went to was an ex-major from the SAS, who was running the course down in Kent. And they do all kinds of things, like they tie you up and blindfold you and stuff. My partner's here in the audience, and at one point during my interrogation, during the mock sort of interrogation, and it's quite frightening, you put you into stress positions for about 4 or 5 hours and all of that, and put you in a shipping container and blindfolded and whatever. And at one point when I was taken out to be interrogated, they'd taken a photograph of my partner from my mobile phone and said, you better get the answers to the question right, because you won't be seeing her again, So it was very psychologically kind of demanding. But the reason I mention that is because it's an indicator if you don't do those courses, you cannot operate in these areas, and they are prohibitively expensive. A colleague of mine, Jen Stout, who's been working in Ukraine recently, doing fantastic stuff. Jen couldn't, she comes from Shetland, she could not get down to do these courses. The courses are thousands of pounds. So if you've got to pay for that out of your own pocket, But, the newspaper companies are quite happy once you toddle off and you've got all of these qualifications, and that's before also the body armour, the helmet, the kit. You can't travel without all of that stuff as well. So it's immensely difficult to operate. But I've found now that I've kind of stepped back from that hard news gathering and started to, maybe this is how I'm able to manage these different streams, is that I started to do stuff which is a bit more reflective, if you like. It's partly to do with getting old. It's partly to do with, the platforms for sharp-end news gathering are not as readily available as they were previously. So, exhibitions, books, filmmaking, using the expertise of the last 4 decades to try and say something that's got a bit more clout and a little bit more depth to it than just responding to a news perspective. But it is immensely difficult to operate in that. The industry's changed a lot. The support mechanisms for example, if you've been a long time exposed to this, PTSD, all of that kind of stuff, any rehabilitation, because it was a big problem in the industry for a lot of very well-known correspondents. But the industry's kind of shifted tack on that, but mainly if you're a staffer, not if you're a freelance, of course.
It's also the small matter of staying solvent.
It's the big matter of staying solvent, absolutely. And that's why I think I'm fortunate insofar as I've got different strands. I can exhibit, I can do talks, I can even paint. Would you believe?
You can come to book festivals.
You can come to book festivals or whatever.
We've got somebody in the middle there, which would probably have to be the last one.
Yes, thanks, David. That's really interesting. But I think we're worse than dropping the baton. I think we handed the baton to them.
To them being?
To the Russians, to the Chinese and so on. We've just lost the plot in relation to this. And examples of that I'd give are, people like Boris Johnson, who slopes off for a wee party with the Russian people in the Italian Alps when it suits them and so on. But we've connected that whole world up for them, allowed them to buy up tracts of our whole London, for one, yachts in the Clyde that come up with oligarchs who come to visit. It's that whole cluster of things that we've got into bed with, some of us, not all of us.
Could you maybe make your question, because we're running out of time?
Well, just quickly, we don't manage our relationships with these countries in the proper way, with due diligence.
If I can just say, I think actually, if we've dropped a baton, I think also Russia's dropped a baton big time as well, and I think that's become evident from their military performance, if I can call it that, in Ukraine. When I covered the war in Georgia, that short mid-noughties war, I think it was 2007, you remember when the Russians came in through South Ossetia into Georgia. And we're just an hour's drive from Tbilisi in the capital. And I remember going up to meet the Russian troops at that time, and they were just outside a town called Gori, which is the birthplace of Stalin. And these elite, I was told, elite Russian troops appeared in these ramshackle tanks that looked straight out of the Second World War. Their uniforms were threadbare. Most of them were drunk. And I was told they were elite. They'd fought in Chechnya. Now, if that was the elite in the Russian army at that time, God knows what the Mobiks are like. Admittedly, Vladimir Putin then refurbished and revamped huge swathes of the Russian military post that war in Georgia. But what he did do was, there's an expression, if you don't mind me saying this, in Glasgow, an old expression, all fur coat and nae knickers, It was a kind of window dressing operation. So there were elements of the Russian military that were definitely pumped up. We saw that in Crimea when the little green men and stuff went in there. But whole swathes of the Russian military have not been modernised. They've dropped the baton as well because they've had their own problems in other areas, reaping the benefits of the oligarchs and the money around the world. So, you know, we've dropped the baton, but so have they. And they're paying for it right now. And that's why the importance of NATO. I mean, I know people have got, you guys sit here right slap bang next to, you know, the stuff that really is the sharp end as well. But, you know, NATO has proven to be very, very important in this war in Ukraine. And it would only be a very naive person, frankly, who said otherwise.
Could I make it clear at this juncture that all fur coat and knee knickers is Edinburgh?
Is it? All right. I always suspected as much, to be honest.
However, we are going to. I'm going to ask you to thank David properly in a minute, but there's got one or two quick things to say because I thanked a lot of people this morning. If you remember, those of you who were here this morning who ran the cafe bar and ran the green room and but I omitted, of course, a hugely important part of the operation here, which is the technical team, because poor Phil back there has been sitting there loyally throughout all of the sessions, making all the sound work, and Dave and Rachel and Arlene, I don't know where Arlene is anymore, but anyway, they've all made all this work, and it's been a huge, we've done a lot of things that we haven't tried before. We live streamed Ricky Ross yesterday, and of course we had these 3 clips that David's producer sent down for us to play through the screen here. So we've tried a lot of new things this year, and we couldn't have done it without the technical team. And if you happen to notice all over the place some fabulous pieces of floral art, they were nothing to do with me. That's down to Jeanette, so thanks to her too. Many thanks to David Pratt.
Thank you.